In this section, we're going to explore a kind of pedagogy that we call authentic pedagogy. And we're going to explore it at a couple of levels, in a couple of layers. One is at a top kind of level is the evolution of these ideas in educational thought. And then at a very practical level, we're going to talk about the way in which these ideas translate into literacy curriculum. So again, to set the bigger context, we're looking at these different models of literacy pedagogy, and we're looking at them in a way which is both trying to analyse, how they work and what they do, but also think critically about which bits of them would we like to use ourselves in which moments for our own literacy pedagogy. Okay, so authentic literacy pedagogy. The origins of this idea in the Western tradition actually begin perhaps with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century French philosopher. And he begins quite a long tradition which critiques didactic pedagogy as boring, as not engaged with the student, as shoveling information out and passively ingesting that information in a way that doesn't always seem relevant, and so on. But then what we have at the beginning of the 20th century is really two profoundly important people, John Dewey and Maria Montessori, who build this approach to pedagogy that we call didactic pedagogy. Now, John Dewey was an American philosopher and educator. He lived a very, very long life, and in fact, some of the educational work that he did was done very early in his life. He had an experimental school in Chicago, and he wrote a very influential and important book called Democracy in Education. So what he argued was, look, authentic education is intrinsic to democracy. And what does this word authentic mean? And for that matter, what did it mean to Rousseau? Well, unlike didactic education, which was about formal memorization, learning rules, sitting passively doing as you're told, authentic education was experiential for Dewey. It was doing things. It was being actively engaged. It was doing stuff that was relevant to your life and manifestly relevant, as opposed to stuff where you were just doing it to get the score you needed to do well at school. So the experimental work that Dewey did and the ideas that he developed became very, very important. And in fact, the movement in the 20th century was called progressive education or progressivist education. Now, we've used the word authentic because, what does progress mean? Everyone wants to be progressive, don't they? It doesn't really tell you what it's about. Authentic means a certain kind of trueness to students' interests, students' needs, relevance to life. That's why we use the word authentic.
In this section, we move from what we've called so far didactic pedagogy in literacy to progressive pedagogy, in particular what has been termed authentic pedagogy. So I just want to pause for a minute and just remind us what didactic means. It's kind of like the word to dictate, which is to tell and for somebody to copy accurately. Clearly there was a movement in history, and John Dewey and others spearheaded this change that was going to occur in education and said, life has changed. That kind of pedagogy is not useful for the kind of society that people live in. It might have been useful for a rural society or a pre-industrial society, but the world has changed dramatically, and we need different types of citizens, workers, and learners. And in fact, for John Dewey and others as part of the progressivist pedagogy movement, they saw, and particularly Dewey, that what underpinned the promise of democracy was two things. One was school and the other was civil society. And school, in his conception, involved sociality. It wasn't just about knowledge, what you knew, but it was a social activity, and it involved actual interaction in order to become part of the new world and have the skills, sensibilities and knowledge required to be in a world that was changing so rapidly. John Dewey himself believed that students thrived not when they just listened and copied, the didactic methodology, but when they actually interacted with curriculum, when they were part of co-designing the learning, and when it was meaningful to their everyday life. wasn't just about particular knowledge that came to you through an authoritarian teacher.
The other great person, early 20th century person, is Maria Montessori. And she began in the early 20th century working in very, very poor schools in Rome. She was originally a medical doctor, to be quite frank, and tried to build a highly engaged pedagogy. And this is how it worked. Around the room, and by the way, Montessori classrooms today still work the same way. She's was a charismatic person, and people in a very doctrinaire kind of way try to do exactly as she said today in classical Montessori schools. Now, so here's the Montessori classroom. Around the room there are these stations. And Maria Montessori builds things that she calls contraptions. So she invented the idea of things called rods, which demonstrate fractions. There's a full rod, there's a half rod, there's a quarter rod. You reassemble them and you understand in a very tangible, concrete kind of way the concept of a whole and its parts, fractions. She had maps of the world, which were like jigsaw puzzles, where the students could put their fingers on them and feel the different countries of the world. So these were things, these beautiful wooden objects, which were called contraptions, and around the room there were little workstations, and the students went around the room learning these things in a very engaged, hands-on kind of way. In fact, she became very influential in kindergarten and early childhood education, although she built this pedagogy so it runs right through, certainly into the elementary or primary school as well. So these two people are the founders of this whole idea called progressive education. Now, here's a picture of what the contrast is. And this, by the way, is from a book published in 1928, a book called The Child-Centered School. So one of the things about didactic pedagogy, it's teacher-centered, it's curriculum-centered, it's content-centered, learn this stuff. Whereas one of the aspects of authentic pedagogy is that it's child-centered, authentic to the students' interests and needs and relevant to them. So this is actually the frontispiece of a very famous book published in 1928 where they wanted to contrast the layout of the traditional classroom with the child-centered classroom, the didactic classroom with the authentic classroom, or the classroom of authentic pedagogy, to use the terminology we've been developing in this series of videos.
In terms of literacy, what did that mean? Acquiring reading and writing involved authentic experiences where you saw natural growth, and children came off speaking and listening, what they already had, and this was continued with activities that led them from listening and speaking to reading and writing. And it involved all learners in this moment of authentic pedagogy being immersed in meaning, being immersed in making sense of whatever was going to be introduced to them new by connecting it to what they already knew. So the new and the old weren't separated. It wasn't that the old was packaged knowledge and the new was you being open to it. Your life experience, what you brought to the new mattered, and they had to come together. And this is called, and has been called, learner-centered pedagogy, shifting away from control by the teacher, teacher-centered and content-centered, to engagement, interaction, and leaving space for self-expression. Didactic pedagogy had no space for self-expression. That wasn't part of what you did as a citizen or a learner or a worker. Your view and your understanding of any particular thing mattered less than what you needed to do and who you were doing it for.